There was a fellow who told me a couple months ago that I will never be as big as I want to be. And like I already am. Like I'm already further than I ever thought I would get. And it is a blessing and a privilege to get to tell stories to people that are abject nonsense that I've made up, and for those stories to be meaningful and to mean something to people.
Do you love science fiction and fantasy books? You found yourself in the right dimension. Welcome to the greatest podcast in the multiverse, where each week I talk to science fiction and fantasy authors about myth, magic, and the infinite possibilities of storytelling. I'm your host, Herman Stuernagel, and I will be taking you on a journey with some of your favorite authors, helping you to get to know them and possibly uncover some new literary gems along the way. Ready to explore? Because on this show, every conversation is a doorway into a different world. So welcome once again to the greatest podcast in the multiverse. I am thrilled today to have the great Christopher Ruocchio here with me today. Christopher, it is a pleasure to have you here, and I am really excited to chat with you.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, you are very welcome. Now, Christopher, is there a paperback in the world that is harder to get than Empire of Silence right now?
Probably not, although I'm happy to report that the paperbacks for Empire of Silence have been reprinted. They appear to have dropped on Amazon, but I don't know that they've arrived at Amazon's warehouse yet because there is the little Prime sticker on them, so I think they're effectively pre-ordering them again. The book had been out of print for the last 2 months because my sales went up about 500-600%. And my poor publisher had not anticipated this, so they had not printed enough. And the reprints are sort of automated, and so they had scheduled one for a few months out, based on the current rate of sale.
Right.
And they could move it up a little bit, but they couldn't move it up enough. So for a minute there, for 2 months, which is a bit longer than a minute, unfortunately, the first 2 books in my series have been unavailable anywhere in North America. So. Very unfortunate problem to have, but I think we'll bounce back from it okay. So,
yeah, for sure. I mean, in some ways, it's a good problem to have. I mentioned it because I've been trying to get a copy of your book for a while now, and I'm up here in Canada. I checked. I know Indigo had some that I could order now. Finally, I think yes, as of yesterday, but it was still like a month wait to actually get it. So, but I'm happy to see that I could at least order it.
I don't know how long it takes for copies to percolate from, because publishers have a central warehouse, and then those will get distributed to distributors like Ingram, right? And then bookstores will order from them. So I talked to my local bookstore, and they didn't see copies in Ingram yet, but Amazon was seeing them, I guess, in their system as they were taking orders again. So it takes a little bit for these things to correct themselves, which is, of course, very frustrating. But at least, the ebooks were there, the audiobooks were there.
Yes.
It's just... I also can't think of an author who's been more victimized by the normal functioning within the publishing industry in the last couple of years than I have been, which is just it's been a time. Fortunately, things seem to be clearing out, and I've found stabler waters. So good. We'll see how the next couple of years go.
Good. Yeah. So I mean, they're coming down the pipeline, but I did grab a copy for my Kindle, which I'm very happy I did. You've been on my radar for some time, and we'll talk about your reviews from Patrick and Daniel here yet. But that kind of is what inspired me to finally pick up and read your book, because I'm a big Red Rising fan. And kind of some of the comparisons there, and I picked it up, and I'm absolutely loving it. So I'm so happy that I did, and that I can talk to you here about it. It's absolutely wonderful.
Yeah, awesome. The Red Rising thing is always very funny, because I say this all the time because people don't believe me, but I didn't even know it existed until I was accused of stealing from it. And then when I looked it up, my first thought seeing the cover was like, is this about the Russian Revolution? It's got the sickle and Red Rising.
Red
so I was like, why am I being compared to this? And then you read the description, and you're like, oh, it's Space Romans. Okay, cool, I get it. It's weird that publishing is big enough that I can miss a New York Times bestseller, but here we are.
Very. I mean, there's so much out there, right? It's hard to keep tabs on everything that's being published, right? So it's very, very understandable. And it's something that I think has bloomed in popularity in the last year or so with Lightbringer and Dark Age kind of coming out and continuing the series. But like I said, your book was on my radar for a couple of years now, but it's something that I'm sorry I didn't pick up sooner.
Oh well, I'm glad you did. So
Yeah, me
thank
too.
you.
Thank you. So, let's, I guess, get into talking a little bit more about yourself and your writing journey. Can you tell us a little bit about you and, your author career?
Yeah, sure. So I started trying to write seriously. Like I knew I wanted to be a writer very, very young. This always sounds fake, but I started trying to figure out how to be a writer when I was like 8 or 9. I was in like second or third grade, and I would write stories, on the back of my math notes. You look at any of my notebooks, and then the right page would be all whatever subject it was supposed to be in the binder, and the left page would be abject nonsense. And and that continued all the way through grade school, middle school, high school. And then by the end of high school, I was pretty committed to doing this. I went and got an English degree because I'm a fool, and fortunately managed to parlay that into an actual day job. I worked for Bain Books, who are now my publisher. They weren't originally, and they're picking up the last 2 books in the series. So I worked for them for 7 years. But the week I got the job after my internship, I also sold the book to their competitor. So I lived this weird double life in publishing. I sold Empire of Silence in January 2016. It was July 2018 when it finally came out. And then I put a book out a year, more or less, ever since. I missed 2021, but I had 2 books in 2022, so it kind of balanced out. I didn't have a book out last year, though, unless you count some like self-published stuff, which I mean, you probably should. But book 6 is out now in April, on April 2nd, and I haven't looked back.
That's awesome. Yeah, and I know I heard you talking about in one of your other interviews about Christopher Bologna being an influence, and when you started writing that young. Is that?
Yeah, no. So Aragon came out, I think, when I was in 5th grade. So I was 10.
Yeah.
I have distinct memories of reading it. Those like grade school desks where they've got the like drawer built in that's sort of open on the front so you can put your books in. I remember hiding the book in that and sort of reading when I wasn't supposed to be. And obviously, like the books are very different, right? But what I sort of took away from it was that he was 15, right? And 15 is like barely older than 10. So I was like, I can do this, right? Like I thought I had to be 80, right? You always see. I remember seeing like Tolkien's picture in the back of the books, right? Or like Brian Jacques. I never really got into Redwall. I have a pathological dislike of talking animals, but I remember there was a newspaper interview with him on the wall in our library in school, and he's like, "Oh, he's old too. I guess I have to be old."
Yeah.
But then Aragon came out, and I was like, "Oh, that's not true." And it was cool because I got to meet the other Christopher. A couple of years ago now, I was at Dragon Con, and he was doing a panel in the room. I was going to do a panel in right before me. So, he lingered to talk to somebody, and I met him on the way in and said, this basically. And it was cool. He was very gracious, which authors aren't always. So that was, that was really cool.
Yeah, I do love it. And I mentioned that because when I was a bit older than that, but when Aragon came out, I had this kind of the same feeling that there's this young guy who's writing and putting a book out. And I waited another 20 years before I before I did anything with that thought. But at the time, I remember it being very inspiring. So I'm glad that you had kind of the same, and I'm glad that you pursued that because that's something that where I got my English degree and then got a job in banking promptly after.
many such cases, right?
Yes.
Yeah. No. It was the only thing I ever really considered doing. I, like a lot of kids, I wanted to be an astronaut, right? But sometimes goals like that are so like Olympian in a certain sense. I mean, I guess writing is too, but like astronaut is still harder, right? Like,
yeah, right.
And
there's a lot more barriers to entry for astronaut.
Yeah, and it turns out I'm like not good at math, so like that was kind of an obstacle. But there were a couple other episodes where I thought maybe I wanted to be a psychologist, but I didn't seriously entertain anything other than writing for any period of time. And I when I was panicking about getting rejection letters from agents, I remember calling my mother and being like, "Mom, I've done this with no net, right? Like I'm doing all these stunts with no net, and I'm about to, fall onto the circus floor." But fortunately, I caught the trapeze in time and
Yeah.
made it. I was only out of college for like 3 weeks when I sold the book, which was
Oh
pretty
wow. So
pretty great. So
yeah. So the time now. How long had you been querying before that point?
so 2015, I finished the book. It was a bit of a different book, but I finished the book in April. I think like right around April 1st of that year, maybe April 2nd, 3rd, something like that, early April. And I got an agent end of November. Um,
Oh wow.
so, and in that process, I netted some like 51, 52 rejections,
Oh
um,
okay.
which is um, pretty normal.
Yeah.
It might even be low. So, and most of those rejections are just agents not answering, right? Agents always say, if you don't hear from us, it's a no. That's kind of not true. It means they came into work on Monday and emptied their inbox. And so sometimes you can, resubmit. They say not to do that, but they get too many to remember. So one of
Right.
my bits of querying advice to writers is don't like go back the next week, but in 6 months, just query again. You'll be fine. Don't cross anyone off until they actually say no. But don't, harass them either, right? You got to space it out.
Definitely.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah. That's great advice and advice I hadn't heard before actually. So it's good to know.
yeah, I got that from my friend DJ Butler, who is also a writer. He actually is also my editor. He's got multiple hats, literally. But in any case, I heard him saying that once, and I was like, oh, that's a really good point, actually.
Yeah.
I did not do that too much or too consciously, but he sort of crystallized that one for me. Um,
Yeah. Right.
yeah.
Cool. Very cool. And so you know that you always knew that this is what you wanted to do. Well, I guess what's your motivation and drive behind that? Why is writing in your DNA?
I don't really like have a good answer to that, honestly. Which is kind of a funny thing to say. It's just one of those things. I would be bored if I didn't. I think
Hmm.
I'm frequently dissatisfied. I'm almost always dissatisfied with the stories that I'm reading or watching or whatever. And I always, will sit there and think, well, that was good, but like if we'd done this instead, it maybe would have resonated better, or it would have been more interesting. I think a lot of writers have that basic reflex. I think that's what prompts a lot of us to start in the first place.
Hmm.
And I love Tolkien. I think was really sort of the sort of crystallizing event. I started reading Tolkien around the time the movies were coming out, 2001, 2002. So
Right.
I was pretty young, maybe 8, 9, and I couldn't quite manage Lord of the Rings. I was reading pretty early and at a pretty high level pretty early, but that was still a stretch. So my parents got me the audiobooks, so I had the CDs, and they were the only audiobooks I owned, and so I listened to them on loop. I fell asleep listening to them for like 10 years,
Hmm.
and I read not just the Silmarillion, but like all the other volumes, right, at some point
Nice.
in my life, most of which I've forgotten. But uh, what Tolkien had done, right, in building basically, his own synthetic mythology, right, which is really a different project than like most writers actually are
Hmm.
doing, right,
Totally.
was so impactful, just like on my mind, right, just that you could do that, like that was a thing that was allowed or possible, was so cool, right? And there's like art is ultimately like persuasive aesthetically, right? So really, you know uh we can talk about like why all the time. The answer is because it's cool, right?
Right.
It's because you read about Aragorn and Smaug the dragon and hobbits and elves, or about Arrakis Dune desert planet, or whatever, right? And you're like, this is pretty awesome. It turns out like the real world is also pretty awesome, but like as a kid you're like, there are no robots or dragons, and that is a bummer. I still feel that way. Like I love history, but I feel that way
Yeah.
once history starts to get too modern. I'm like, this is too real. Like this is lame.
Hmm.
Reality not as good. And I like always wanted to play with that clay. Right. I wanted to mess around with robots and whatever
Yeah.
else.
Right. Yeah. Awesome. And um, so I guess let's circle back a little bit. I want to come back to the history part of that. But let's talk. Tell us, I guess, a little bit of Empire of Silence for the listeners that maybe have not heard about it and the Sun Eater series as a whole. What is it all about?
Yeah, sure. So the Sun Eater is a science fantasy space opera adventure. Very much in the tradition of Dune or Star Wars. It's set 20,000 years in our future, not a galaxy far, far away. And the main character is a young nobleman named Hadrian who runs away from home. He does not want to be a bureaucrat. He does not want to be the priest of a false god. And so he runs away, and he finds himself stuck in the middle of a war between the human empire and the first aliens who, in 20,000 years, have ever really posed a threat to it. They're called the Cielcem. They are sort of the outer space equivalent of like the Huns, right? They are migratory. They don't really stay anywhere. They just fall into a star system and make a big mess and then run away, which makes them very hard to fight. It's hard to find anything in space. And so Hadrian has an interest in them and an interest in peace and an interest in languages and other cultures. And he tries to parlay that into peace and fails and has to find another way. And on page one of the books, because they're written in his words, they're written in first person as a memoir, he tells you he's the man who ended the war and wiped the Cielcen out. And so his story is why and how, and about all the ways in which the official history that you, of course, have heard, right, is wrong. So this is sort of also the real story, the secret history, as it were, of these events, not the official imperial version that is, of course, all lies. So it is. It will be 7 books. 6 of them are written. The 6th is out in April. The 7th I am about 20% of the way into. I'd take a break for this month. I owe too many people short stories. But I'll get back to it here pretty soon. So
yeah, excellent. Yeah, a lot to unpack there. I guess that's first. I just want to talk a little bit about. You mentioned and the end is on the front on the first page. What made you decide to start the book off that way? And I know you've had some mixed reception to that. Can you talk a little bit? Tell us a little bit about that.
sure. I think the germ of it is the fact that and this is very silly and maybe a bit petty, but I hate the way that people yell at people for mentioning spoilers online, in real life, wherever. Because too many times in my own life, I've just been trying to have a conversation, often with people who already know what I'm talking about, and then someone who happens to be in earshot will be upset about this. And I've always had this sense, because I'm the sort of person who will read the summary of a movie or a book before I watch it or read it, because I don't really it doesn't matter to me what happens. It matters how it happens.
Right.
And I wanted to write a story that was about how it happens. Right. Because a lot of times when you get a spoiler, right, you don't have the context. And so either it is completely incomprehensible, or it's not impactful in the right way, or you don't understand what you've heard. Yeah. And so I wanted to tell a story that played with that, right? Because the story that you're told on the first page isn't the whole story, and it's not. I don't want to say not the correct story, but it's not the complete. It's not the complete story, which I guess is redundant, but of me to say. But it isn't, right? And so if you give the reader a piece of the ending like that, then they have expectations that alter their experience reading the whole book, right? Mm-hmm. And that brings a whole new set of questions into the game. And if the reader is sort of thinking about those questions, I think it makes the experience more interesting, more sort of dimensionalized, and it makes it more. I always like to say nutritious, right? Like I think of stories as having nutritional content, and if all you're reading for is what happens on the next page, then you're eating Doritos, and that is like Doritos are fine, but in moderation. Yes. But there is better food out there, and there's better food for you. And if I make a book that you have this extra dimension to, you're sort of more interested, I think, in rereading them. And I think when you reread books, you always get more out of them the first time, unless there's nothing to get out of the book in the first place, right? And so
that makes sense.
I think just by doing this, I change the sort of nature, not just of the story, but of readers' experiences of the story. And I'm more interested in the story itself, right? The journey, right? Mm-hmm. And if you know where you're going to an extent, then you can enjoy the journey a little bit more, because you're not worried about the surprise. Are we going to Disney World? Are we, Mom? And in the case of Sunny, the answer is no. It's like way worse than Disney World, but at least and so it just sort of changes the reading experience, and hopefully in a positive way. There's some people who don't like it, but I can't help them. So
right.
No.
Yeah, I appreciate it. It's a definitely different, focusing on the journey rather than the destination, and I think that comes across because we're looking at Hadrian's perspective from the kind of the future looking back, and I think that offers a different layer of dynamic to the story as well.
Yeah,
Which
and
I
it's also not like it takes surprise off the table either, right?
Yeah,
Because
right.
there's like you can't put the whole book on the first page. I always laugh when people say things like, oh, I know the whole ending. I'm like, you don't though. These books are each a 250,000 words long. Like you're not getting that from the cover flap. Like
Yeah, right.
they're just misguided when they say that. Uh,
I want to talk a little bit. You mentioned as well about history as well, and there's a lot of
mhm.
Roman Empire influence. I know there's. I mean, it's a meme, and I know you've been asked about it before. But how often does Christopher Ruocchio think about the Roman Empire?
I don't really stop. When the meme started, my wife just laughed. She was like, I'm not even gonna bother," because she hears me talk about it all the time anyway. So, in my defense, it's not just that, right? Like I'm just
Right.
always talking. What were we? We're talking about Zoroastrianism earlier. She like asked a random question. I don't know why she brought Zoroastrianism up, but I then explained the cosmological differences between their universe and the Christian one, and
Hmm.
went on for like 20 minutes, and then she wandered off. Mid lecture, quite rudely. But like I said, it turns out the real world is actually interesting, and this is something that that sounds silly to say, right? But there are a lot of people who, I always laugh at like lore videos for whether it's for books or for video games, right? Because it's like I love Dark Souls, right? But if you watch the like level of attention and analysis that Dark Souls like lore YouTubers put into analyzing a video game that was made 13 years ago, like they would make
Hmm.
very good biblical scholars, right? They would make very good classical literature analysts, right?
Right.
Trying to figure out translation differences between like one version of the Odyssey and another, and like trying to reconcile fragments. Like they'd be great at it.
Right. Yeah.
If only that skill could be harnessed in some way. Um, I always thought like, oh, I should go and do Dark Souls lore videos, and then just randomly do one about, Orestes, and then see if anybody's like, "Where's this in the game?" I was like, well, not quite, but
Yeah. um, you know, what is it about the Roman Empire? Do you think specifically? I know history is in general part of what you're interested in, but what about the Roman Empire specifically? I guess captures our attention that most guys who are asked this question answered more often than you think, kind of thing.
yeah, I think a big part of it is that Rome is at sort of the foundation blocks of our civilization, right? And I know this is maybe an unpopular thing for people to talk about now, because of course, like, what do you mean our civilization, right? And everybody gets very bent out of shape about this. But I mean Western civilization, right? I mean what we used to call Christendom, right? Christendom was sort of predicated on three cornerstones, right? Athens, Jerusalem, and Rome. The conversation usually forgets about Rome, which is very strange to me. But like Rome is at the basis of a lot of our sort of legal traditions, right? It's
Right.
still in there.
Yeah.
A lot of the sort of bureaucratic weft of the empire got translated into the Catholic Church and remains there, right? The Pope is still
Yeah.
supreme pontiff, right? Like that is a
Yep.
title that was instantiated by Numa Pompilius, right? The second king of Rome, the successor to Romulus, right? That title is still in effect, which I think is amazing. People always are like, "Oh, fantasy's so silly. Like, you have all these institutions that last for thousands of years," and I'm like, interesting.
Yeah.
You clearly don't know much. But I think there is a continuity, right, of not just like ethics, right, in terms of like legal codes, but aesthetics. Obviously, like you look at Washington D.C., we like try to look Roman, we try to look
Yeah.
Greek. It was very, very much in the minds of America's founders, right? It was very much in the minds of the British Imperials of the Georgian and Victorian eras, right? They were, when they were building St. Paul's, and they were building, all of rebuilding London in a lot of ways
Right.
during that period. They were trying to sort of Romanize it, um,
Yeah.
and it's still there. But I also think that there's the there's something romantic about the past, kind of in general, because it seems simpler to us, and it wasn't, right? But when you look at systems like empire, right, where you have a autocratic, monarchic figure at the top, right? That's a character in a way that like the Federal Bureau of Investigation is not a character, right?
Yes.
And I had this question. I did an interview with Eric Flint. This was years ago, and Eric was an alternate history writer. Eric was also a communist, and I loved Eric very much. He was a very generous man and great writer. But he was sort of busting me for having feudal lords in space. He's like, "Why do you think we're going backwards? Like, like why do you think this will happen?" And it's like, I don't know if there's such a thing as backwards, right? Like, I
Yeah.
think
Right.
that Aristotle is basically right. There are three forms of government, period. And we just sort of flip between them. But I think that from like a dramatic standpoint, I think people like to think about kings and emperors and princesses and dukes because those are heroic figures and you can
Yeah.
fit them on a playbill, right? Like they can
Yeah.
go
Right.
on the dramatis personae in a way that like people don't like the Star Wars prequels because they don't want to know about the Senate, right? They want to
Mm.
see Princess Leia,
Yeah.
right? They want like you can get away with it with like the Chancellor or whatever, right? But like
Right.
you need a finite cast of characters, and I think when you look at Roman history, you have Julius Caesar, right? You have Caligula, right, who is wrongly maligned, but like you have these, you have these dynamic little figures that you can actually look at and understand, and you have that in modern society, but like you don't like if you try to really understand how like the bureaucratic systems of modern states work, they aren't romantic at all.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that there is sort of an impulse to like look back at for a time when agency was actually embodied in individual people in a way, and I think that that is appealing to like the dramatic sense that people feel. Right? I think we
Yeah.
look at history. The whole great man theory is sort of spat at by academics, but like basically any casual observer of history likes to look at people, right? They like to look at
Mm-hmm.
Napoleon.
Definitely.
They like to look at Christ or Muhammad or Shakespeare or like whatever, right? Because stories are about people, right? They
Yes.
aren't about institutions,
Right.
really.
Yeah.
Institutions are fake, right? Like they are actually made up of people, right? It's just that they are hiding behind the pillars and the curtains and the office doors, and you
Right.
don't really you can't really empathize with like the collapse of the Department of Energy because of some internal political coup. Like who cares,
Yeah.
right?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah,
Exactly. Yeah.
I'm sort
Yeah.
of I'm sort of speechifying here, but like
Yeah. No,
I
it's great. I
yeah
love it. But I think that um, it's a really good point because what you're talking about is characters. You're talking about character development in history. It's easier for us to relate to a character in history than an institution like the Senate, where it's just a name. It's not something that I can relate to in a story. And when you put together a story about a heroic figure or a leader figure, I can either be for or against this person now and at least relate to what they're doing and to some degree, right?
Yeah, and it
And
doesn't even need to be a great person, right? Some of my
mhm.
favorite little historical anecdotes are about like random little people, right? You find a funerary marker where like some guy, you got some Roman who's like, Marcus was a baker. I was born a slave, and like, here I am buried with my wife and our dog or whatever. Like,
Mm.
that's cool, right? Like, it's
Yeah.
nice to know that like that guy existed, right? And he did this thing. I have a friend who's in Italy right now, and he's been sending me pictures back. He was in Naples, which my family's from Benevento, right? And he visited the cathedral, which is where Saint Januarius is buried. And Januarius lived in like the 290s, and he's the guy who converted Benevento to Christianity. So like he's probably the guy who converted my ancestors,
Oh
right? Like
wow.
1700 years ago, right? But he's
Cool.
like a guy, and he's like in that box, right? And
Right. Yes.
he's like right there, and that's not like it's not Napoleon, right? Like obviously he's a saint, so he's not nobody, but like it's cool to like think about like, oh, like this guy actually might have known somebody that 1700 years ago, which is a span of time you can't fathom, like might
Yeah.
actually have been related to me, right? So
Yeah. Which is awesome. And
it's
I
cool,
love
yeah.
I love finding out tidbits about that, about family history, and what's happening at that time. And to your point, I think you're able to take a look at the life of somebody in this time period, and make it makes it a little bit more relatable, and a little bit you can put yourself in their shoes and wonder, what was happening around them at the time.
Yeah, yeah. I just
Yeah,
think it's beautiful, and I think we do this with fiction too, right? People always we have all these like constructs for how we think about story, right? People will say, "Oh, like I like character driven stories." Nobody ever actually says I like plot driven stories, right? Like that person doesn't exist, right? Um, I've never met one, but like the idea that there's such a thing as a plot driven story, I think is just not true at all. Anyway, I think there are maybe writers who are not so good at character, but like stories are about human beings,
yeah, okay.
because that's who they're for,
Hmm.
and so, I think that's why people think about the Roman Empire. I think it's the same reason, that meme could have as easily been like, why are you all always thinking about like the Middle Ages, right? Why are you always thinking about the Crusades? Why are you thinking about the Renaissance or the Civil War or whatever, right? Uh, just the Roman Empire is an easy target. I think.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, like you said, I think too that it just influences so much of our modern day culture that it's, I think, sometimes hard not to look at something and then think about, oh, the Romans did this or influenced this to a certain degree, right? So
yeah. I mean, ever
yeah,
since they fell, Western civilization and to an extent Eastern civilization has been trying to get it back, right? The Turks
yeah,
to this day, are like we're actually the real Romans now, right? And like they don't not have a case, but like we always do this, and this is sort of a plank for my own world building, right? People sometimes get on my case because they're like, why do people remember Shakespeare 20,000 years ago? And I'm like, bro, we read Gilgamesh now. Like maybe you don't, but I do. And like my main character is maybe more like me than you, which shouldn't be surprising. But like we always do this, talking about like the U.S. now or Britain 100 years ago, trying to emulate the aesthetics and sort of style of Rome, right?
hmm,
Every now and then, I mean, the Russians are doing it too, right? They, used to have a three-headed eagle, because Byzantium had a two-headed eagle and Rome had
oh,
a
okay,
single-headed eagle, right? We have an eagle now, right?
yeah,
Like,
yeah,
it doesn't, it's the same eagle as it turns out. There's so much conservation of culture across time.
mm,
Um, and, because it's all one story, right? Um,
right, yeah, yeah. And so, how does, I guess, how did that history plus other inspirations, how did they work their way into your story? Was it, obviously there was a lot of intention there, but how much of a direct influence and inspiration was it?
that's a good question. I think so. People. This is related to like another usual question, which is like, how much research do you do, right? And the answer is like, I don't really know, but I like never stop, right? I'm just always learning about something because I'm always, I never stop being curious. But now,
Right.
now that I'm out of school, I can actually learn things I want to learn instead of whatever they want to teach me.
Hmm.
And so, I'll just read about stuff that I think is interesting, and invariably, whatever I'm reading about at the time filters into the text in some way and
Okay.
informs the world building in some direction or not. I knew I wanted a galactic empire. I knew I wanted it to be sort of Greco-Roman, and in its inception, it was sort of early Byzantine in its world building more than it was Roman. Roman, like there are like logothetes and stuff, right? It was supposed to have been more redolent of like Justinian's Constantinople than it was of Rome proper. But
Okay.
I picked a couple like Western terms and threw them in there as well because they're a bit more familiar to your average, English speaker. And
Yeah,
too much Greek, I think, would you know be poison to some people. It's a little
that's
bit of a
fair.
harder language, and so I sort of backed into just being another space Rome. I tried to be a little bit different at first, but I picked Constantinople. I picked Eastern Rome because Dune had picked the Arab world, right, and Rome
Yeah.
had been. People had done Rome before. I had no aversion to doing Rome proper, but I thought like, hey, this will be the thing that'll be different. And despite my best efforts, I was pulled back toward Rome anyway because there's no escape. Turns out all roads lead there, as I've heard people say before.
Someone has said that. Yes.
Yeah, yeah, it's out there somewhere. And So that was sort of like the basic template. But there, the Sollan Empire in the books really is trying to set it up as like a successor to Earth, right? As a successor to human civilization. And so there are elements of their culture that belong to other cultures, right? That they very
Mhm.
self consciously, at least in their early days, cribbed. So they're in their religious practices, they leave food offerings and burn candles to tutelary deities in the same way that like Hindus do, right?
Mhm.
So their temples look very Hindu on the inside. And this is concealed somewhat by the fact that like the book is written with a lot of Greco-Roman language because the book is pretending to be translated, and that was just how the translator did it.
Okay.
Because my grounding in Hindi is like non-existent, right? Like
Hmm.
I know Latin reasonably well, or at least I did. I haven't practiced very much since I left school, but I have
You
small
have a
Latin and less
foundation for it,
Greek,
though, at least.
but
Yeah.
yeah, but I have like no Sanskrit, right? So, but like there's some Chinese influence in the world building as well, particularly like the legal code and the system of corporal punishment is very much like Qing Manchurian China. So like there's a bit of that gets filtered in there as well, and other cultures will manifest in like little details, right? Because at
Right.
some
Yeah.
point, the ancient, first few generations of the empire were like, some guy was like, oh, like I like this thing, like why don't we bring that back in some way and institutionalize it? And it's gone on now for so many thousands of years that people don't know it was a LARP,
Mm.
and so. Uh, it's very hard to pinpoint like exactly how much is was sort of like planned up front because most of it I think sort of filters in when I'm like, oh, like this would be a nice detail to bring in. Like there's one
Right.
culture that practices the sort of morning ablutions the way that like Arabs do, right? So these like little details will come in because I'll be reading about them and think, oh, like where could I fit that in, and how could I use this, and then often like turn it on its head or turn it sideways because it's been 20,000 years. So maybe readers who like know what I'm talking about will be like, was this a thing? But most people are just like assuming. I guess I made a lot of stuff up. Um,
And like, so how much of that do you plan up front? How much of it is kind of as you go, and how much of it, like, how do you keep track of it all as you're putting it down?
so I am like a pretty intense outliner. At least I have been since book two. Book one, I didn't really outline because I didn't have a process yet. And but when I'm outlining, it's mostly plot because most of my writer's block issues are the result of failing to understand the scene I'm writing completely. It's good
Right.
to like know where you're going before you begin, right? Because uh, I personally believe that everybody should outline. I think that even people who can write books without them, up to and including writers who are much more famous than me, would be improved by outlining. Not that I'm the boss of them, but I believe outlining is essential. But I'm mostly figuring out plot. I'll make notes about like characters, sort of emotional arcs and stuff. But a lot of those like little world building details are I leave to momentary inspiration. Right, you're filling out a scene, and you're like, oh, like this is great, right? A lot of the like symbolic stuff and the little motifs and things will sort of generate as a consequence of just being in the moment. And as I talk so much about how much I outline that I worry that readers think that you can't be spontaneous or shouldn't be. But these things are like not mutually
Right.
exclusive at all, actually. Right? You can plan and then like and the plan can take you to inspiration, right? And the inspiration can inspire a new
Hmm.
plan because of course you like are always like pantsing your outline, actually, right? And if you aren't,
Right.
then you pants the brainstorming that you got the outline from, right? Like there's the inspiration is always an element. Like these are not enemies; they are, in fact, like compatible partners, right?
Right.
So it's hard to put like a number on it, but I do both, right? So like Howling Dark, which is the second book, has a sort of protracted like Dante Milton thing going on, right? That was in the outline because that's like too big to not be in the outline.
Right.
But
Okay.
like the little individual instances of how the Paradise Lost references appear are spontaneous, right? Sometimes,
Nice.
right?
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, and I think for people that pants too, at least I've found, um, you're you're doing an outline. You're just doing it a longer version of it, and then when something doesn't work, you just have more to throw out, kind of thing.
Yeah.
That's if you're like you said, pantsing the outline, you're putting that structure in place, just not filling in all the details yet, kind of thing.
Yeah, yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, my I got in trouble for posting this on Facebook once. This was years ago, but I said a pantser's outline is their first draft, and a couple people who pants were mad at me, because then they informed me that they just published the book unedited, and I'm like, great, good for you. That is a choice, uh, but people are very protective of themselves, and they have every reason to be. But
Right.
I still think I'm right. um, so
Yeah, I think I mean people I feel like do need to find a system that works for them, because I think some people get stuck just trying to do something that maybe it doesn't come natural to them, and they never get that book out because they're trying to do something that isn't necessarily the way they should be working on it, or
of
works
course.
for how they think things through. But yeah, I do agree that outlining does have benefits.
Yeah, I would never say that people should copy me, right? But I think that writing one draft and publishing it immediately, like maybe with a copy edit, isn't a system. I think that's I
Yeah.
don't think we're there yet. Uh, but of course, right? Like I'm not
Yeah.
proposing that there is a method, right? I'm not Marvel circa like 1965, right? Like you have to write the comics this way, which also they have every right to do. But I think if you're trying to write a book, you need to find mechanisms and a program that work for you. And if you're finding that what you're doing isn't working, then it's actually not your program, right? Like you need to change something. Um,
Mm.
yeah, I completely agree.
Awesome. Yeah, and I guess the second part of my question there, with the world building goes, do you have like a world Bible, or something like that, where you like keep everything, or is it all in your head?
It is mostly in my head. I have the glossaries that were in the backs of the first five books, which are mostly planet names and like some terminology.
Mm.
I don't really ever need to consult the terminology one. Like I know what these words mean.
Yeah. Right.
But the planets I'll look at in case I accidentally duplicate a planet or like reuse a name or something.
Gotcha.
The only other real notes that are in any shape at all are the language notes for mostly for Cielson, because the alien language is the only one that's really a conlang. The other ones are all kind of cheats, because there are something like 12 languages in the books, and most of them are human dialects that are sort of languages that are smushed together or have some way changed.
Hmm.
And for those, I kind of just sort of fake it a little bit. I'll take words from uh, extant languages, and then I will change the spelling or simplify them in some way,
Right.
um, to sort of simulate the passage of time. I don't speak like I have a language that's based on Norwegian and Thai, and I don't speak either of those languages. And man, that's a weird combination. And I picked it because it would be like strange, right? Like, how did that
Right.
happen? But I'm not a talented enough. I'm not Tolkien, right? I'm not a talented enough linguist to try and make that work for real. But it turns out that for like maybe 5 lines of dialogue in a book, you don't actually need the language to work.
Yeah.
But the
Right.
alien language, I have something like 200 lines of dialogue
Hmm.
in a book. So like though that language exists, so I have a folder and I have a notebook of language notes, that exist. But as far as remembering, sometimes there are exceptions. Like I could not remember the like ranking system for soldiers and what their insignia were for each rank so many
Okay.
times that I'd have to control F a few times to find them, and then I finally just wrote everything down. If I
Right.
if I find I'm having a problem like that repeatedly, I'll make a thing for it. But a lot of it has been, I talk a lot about how like I have to kind of work every day because the I need to keep the text basically in play until I'm done. Um, because there's so much about writing, and it's not just like world building notes. It's like if you're writing a fight scene, it's how many guys are there, where were they, like which one had the gun, right? Which one had the knife? Which one had the two knives? which one did I light on fire? Like which one got nuked? Like I don't know, right? Like and if
Right.
you take 3 days off midway through that fight scene, I have to like just start over,
Oh
right?
wow.
Because um, there's just too many little details you lose track of,
Yeah,
you know.
you've lost the flow of it.
Yeah, because so much of writing a scene is like short term memory, right? It's like I think about it like RAM, right? Like how much of my RAM is committed to writing the scene, you know, and if I restart the computer, oops, like all of those cycles have been reallocated, right? So, you know,
Yeah.
I've managed to sustain that for 7 books, which it's really starting to strain my capacity. So
Okay.
I'm glad it's the last book.
Yeah, and I was gonna ask you as well. How I know you talked a bit about your process between books one and two, but how has your process changed over the course of the last 6 books? And how much more refined have you been able to get at?
I don't know that in broad strokes. I don't think it has changed.
Okay.
I still use the same like outline template file that I generated for Howling Dark. I think that I might actually outline a little bit less. Now I think I like have a clearer sense of like, okay, I want to use like it's outlines, right, where it sort of notches in. I'll use like the first level for like the actual summary of the scene at like an action level, like what happens, and then the subpoints will be like like that'll be like like an important thing I need to keep an eye on, and then I'll have subpoints that elaborate on that thing. And I've come to realize that what I really do is I use it's less about writing the outline as a reference than it is about writing the outline as a draft, right? So I'll write the outline as I can write a
Okay.
chapter in a page instead of writing a chapter in 20 pages. And when I get to actually writing the chapter, I like look at the page briefly and be like, which chapter was this? This one, okay. And then I remember writing it, and so what I'm really doing when I'm writing the first time is rewriting. I am
Right.
taking the thing I wrote as a page that I remember writing as a page, and that page is short enough for me to remember what I wrote, right? Like in pretty good
Yeah.
detail, right? And then I will simply turn that into 20 pages or whatever, right? So I
Okay.
don't really like look at the outline intensely after it's written. I just remember that I wrote it and what it said, and I sort of switch off my targeting computer when I actually do the draft. I'm just like, let's like we know where we're going, like let's just feel it out. And sometimes I'll finish a chapter and like I didn't like address a point that I put in the outline, and I'll be like, damn, I will find another place for it.
Hmm.
It's too late because I'm getting out of here, right?
Right. Yeah.
And sometimes things will go a little bit sideways, or they'll go like 10% off or 10 degrees off where I thought they were going to go. And I'm like, oh, that's interesting. Like, how do we get over here? And I think I've actually gotten a little bit looser with regard to the outline between books, but um, you know, I think that it is a refinement in its own way, right?
Yeah.
It's like I say, I think I've talked about outlining so much that I think people have um, an impression of me as like very very didactic and very rigid as a writer, and there's still a lot of latitude for spontaneity, and
For
you
sure.
need that as an artist, right? You need
Yeah.
to be
Right.
able to um, improvise on a theme, right? Vary on a theme, and
Definitely.
freestyle, I guess,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. And if your outline is a page and your book, is 700-800 pages, that's a lot of room to work with.
oh well, the whole outline is like 60 pages,
Okay.
but the like an individual chapter, if it's like a big chapter, it might be a page, right?
Okay. Yeah.
Uh, the longest I think a single chapter ever was in an outline was 3 pages. Um, So that was like that would be something like chapter 43 of Howling Dark, which is the Brethren chapter. Like that was a big chapter to outline.
Okay.
Most of them though were like half a page, you know.
Okay.
So the whole thing ends up being pretty long. I think the book 7 outline is like 50,000 words, which is about as long as my novellas.
Wow. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
they're not
I mean, when
short.
you're looking at an outline that long, you're writing a skinny draft. Essentially at that point, I think too, right? Like
Yeah.
you're working out the story, you're working out the details. It's not like you're point one is this, and you've worked out a lot of those things beforehand.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And Did you know, I guess, when you wrote Empire of Silence, did you know how the entire series was going to progress?
Only in like the broadest possible level, right? Like I knew the sort of main arc, but there are
Okay.
a lot of little epicycles within the series, right? As far as like characters and like their fates, that there's actually a lot more room to plan these things and to like or to not plan these things than readers sort of think. Um, people like my mother is rereading the books right now, and she's like, I'm just like so blown away by like all this stuff from like book 6 that you like have in like the first couple chapters of book 1. And I'm like, that's
Mm,
because when I write one sentence, right, that's referring to a thing I haven't figured out yet, it's just one sentence, right?
right.
And so when it's done, you have this perception that there's this iceberg that you're seeing the tip of right at the beginning of the series that reaches back to this huge thing later. But like, you don't have to know what that huge thing is yet. If
Right.
you like, as long as you keep it true to the one detail that you put at the beginning,
Mhm.
um, you have a lot more flex in how you get there and like what the mystery is. Like there are ways to write like a mystery, right? For example, uh, that you don't have to know the answer to until you know the answer to it, right? As long as it just all makes sense.
Mhm.
I use the example of like I'm pretty sure because like George Martin is famously not an outliner, right?
Yeah.
When he in the first chapter of Game of Thrones, he mentions Mance Rayder, right, the King Beyond the Wall, and I'm sure that when he did that, that he didn't have the character of Mance Rayder figured out, right? I
Right.
think that was
Yes.
just the name, a name for a guy who is that guy,
Right.
right? And when
Yeah.
he gets to write, I think Mance shows up in book 2. I think it's been a long time since I read those books. Like I read them like when book 5 came out, so it's been
Okay.
like 10
It's been a
years,
while.
right?
Yeah.
But I think it's book 2, right? But like, I'm sure he didn't know. Like maybe he knew he was like not he was a Night's Watchman guy originally, but like probably didn't have the whole Dornisman's wife like red thread cape thing figured out. Didn't have his personality,
Mhm.
wasn't thinking of Kieran Hines for the TV show, whatever, right? Like
For sure.
I
Yeah.
don't
It's a
think I
detail
don't
that
think
you
that
can
was there
flesh
yet,
out
but
later.
yeah, but
Yeah.
when you go reread the book and he's there, you're like, oh, it's Mance. Like, I can't wait to see him in book 6. Uh, fighting Ramsay Bolton. It'll be great. But but it looks like it's all there, right? And so there's a
Yeah.
lot of ways to look smarter than you actually have been.
And your books, they expand over a large time scale as well. Um, are there specific difficulties that you've had in doing that, or was that fairly easy to navigate?
No, it's pretty hard. As I mentioned earlier, I'm not so great at math, and so this is actually a perennial difficulty in figuring out the books. In part because it's really hard, for example, to lift a siege if that siege might take 40 years to get lifted, right? Like if it
Mhm.
takes that long for a fleet to get here, you have to come up with ways to have that effect, right, without actually waiting for 40 years because you can't write like a 40-year siege in a
Right.
novel, right? Like in a really dramatic way. Like it just is, it's hard, right? So you have to come up with solutions to problems like that. There are times when I had to figure out how a character could still be alive after 100 years, right? Like what were they doing? Like what was their story? And there are ways to do
Hmm.
that
Yeah.
because people, characters get frozen for 20, 40, 50-year journeys between star systems. They're still moving faster than light. It's just that space is that big, right?
Hmm.
Because
Absolutely.
I always felt that if you're going to do space in a story, like why does it take 2 minutes to get to Alderaan? Like I don't understand, right?
Right.
Like why not just like put it down the block? So I wanted space to have a character and have dimension to it. And so I had to figure out all these sorts of logistical things. There's a bit in book 4 where Hadrian returns to a planet where he left a character in book 3, and I like really wanted him to see her again, but I like looked at the timeline, like it's been way too long. Like there's no way, right?
Yeah.
And so I had to come up with an explanation for. I had to come up with a solution, right? And that solution was actually he like meets her great 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 granddaughter, and like that is still an emotional episode because then we speak to the passage of time and like what that does to characters who are left behind and all of that stuff, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so I ended up with a scene that was like probably better, right? Because often like people think that like constraints are bad for creativity, right? Because like you should just be creative, right? And no
Right.
limits, right? But like limits are great actually. like they force you to get more creative
Hundred
because you have
percent,
to
100% agree with that.
yeah, outthink the limits. It's good to be in a box, actually, because then it's good to be in a corner because then it's really dramatic when you get out of it, right?
Right.
Uh,
Yeah, I do want to kind of keep us within our hour here because I
okay,
do want to let you go. But I think I'd be remiss to not talk a little bit about some of the recent attention you've received from a couple booktubers and that sort of thing, because
sure.
I know it's had a big impact on your year. Can you talk a little bit about how some of this came about and what that has looked like from your end?
Yeah. So it's funny, right? Because the story actually goes back a lot further than I think a lot of the newer readers think. In 2020, my third book came out in July, which was like the worst time a book could come out. And it did not do great because nobody was buying books, or at least they weren't buying my books. Most of the lockdown reading people were doing was getting around to finally reading Game of Thrones after 10 years
Right.
of watching the show and being like, well, what am I going to do now, right? It was good for writers people had heard of, which was not me. So book three came out, and it was kind of not quite dead on arrival, but it was not great. And the problem is that new books are really the thing that sort of push book sales generally. So a new book comes out, there's incentive for the publisher's sales team to remind bookstores that like book one exists. Please put them back on
Right.
shelves, right?
Yeah.
And there were really no bookstores, right? There were
Yeah.
no shelves, and nobody was looking at them, and
Hmm.
so it was a whole thing. And then I made it worse for myself by not having a book out again for another 2 years almost, because had some medical issues in the family, and I was just not working as quickly. I still had a day job at the time too, so then there was like no new book to repush things once things got back toward normal, let's say.
Hmm.
Uh, and But then I think it was at the end of 2020. I think it was in December, that Mike's book reviews reviewed Empire of Silence, and that was like getting a little bit of an adrenaline shot after everything felt pretty much dead. And Mike sort of helped me find a new audience, and I
Nice.
went into this sort of self promotional phase where I was in his Discord server. My fans put together one of their own that I was hanging out in. I went to a bunch of other ones, and I have like since then basically never said no to an interview. Unless I had like four in a week or something, and then I
Right.
was like, "We'll figure out something for like a month from now, please, for my sanity." Right?
Yeah.
You know, but then the thing about BookTube that's so cool is that even if you're a channel of like 500 subscribers, among those 500 are usually other booktubers, right?
Yes.
And
Yeah.
so, and often the big ones, right? And like Mike is very good about trying to like build up smaller channels. He has them on like
Hmm.
his channel, and he's done that for me too, right? Because I have a channel of my own. And so I think having that YouTube channel in a lot of ways contributed to the booktubers sort of adopting me as their pet author, in a lot of ways, right? It's like me and Brian Lee Durfee. And so Empire Silence did a bit of a circuit through a bunch of the like more like mid and smaller channels, since Mike sort of like lit the fuse. And then eventually got around, and in September, Patrick Leo read Empire of Silence, and he loved it, and that convinced Daniel Green that he should read the books as well. And I'd sent Daniel a copy of Empire of Silence back in like 2019, and it just been moldering.
Yeah.
So he read that too. I think he read that in December, and they've both since done videos for every book, and they've more or less loved all of them, which has been a tremendous blessing. And so, because every time the books come out, people remember, oh, I should go buy book one, which would have made having book one in stock really useful.
Right.
But I think in a perverse way, the unavailability of the book for the last 2 months has sort of created a mystique and an interest.
Hmm.
And I think now that the books are coming back into stock, I think it's going to end up having been to my advantage that they were not in stock for a while, because people are
This
pretty
this
excited.
pent up fervor about about getting these books.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
in a way it's sort of like relaunching the book in a certain sense.
Hmm.
I saw the Amazon sales ranking today had gone up to like 4,000, which sounds like a low number, but It had been at like 1 million, so like that was a pretty big jump.
Yeah.
And and we'll see how long it stays there, right? But like I said, when they started doing that, my publisher only printed so many copies, and those basically evaporated like in a couple days. And so, like I say, they had no way of knowing that was going to happen. And
Yeah.
so, they've printed more the second time around.
Okay.
I think they printed twice as much as they printed originally, that's a nice show of confidence. So,
Definitely.
so no, I'm happy, to have been sort of adopted by BookTube here, and I, I've said this before. I basically owe my second wind to Mike. I think maybe if I kept plugging along, the books would have, something would have happened, right? But that something happening would have been someone like Mike, finding it and helping to get it out there, right? So if it wasn't
Hmm.
Mike, it'd been someone else. But I owe Mike a lot, and now I owe Patrick and Daniel a lot too.
Yeah.
So far there has been no real bad press, which thank heavens. There obviously the books have people who dislike them, and it's that's fine. Like they
Yeah.
can. Unfortunately, it's not illegal, but one of these days. But but no, it's been a tremendous blessing, and especially I just had a daughter, and so
Well,
it's been very
congratulations.
good for my family too. Thank you. To have the extra attention and the commensurate income. So yeah, no, it's been very very nice.
I do really love the story of it being, you're obviously, the books I think have done well up until this point, but now book 6 is coming out, and you're seeing this surge of book 1, the first, and now everyone can go back and read the first 5, right? Which I think will be to your benefit. And I mean, just because your first book maybe wasn't, not like I said, not that it did badly, but maybe it wasn't where it could have been upon release. It doesn't mean its story was over, right? Going, now was it six,
He,
8 years
yeah,
later?
and that's like a more common story than people think, right? I
Yeah.
think Song of Ice and Fire, I think, was losing money until Storm of Swords came out, which
Hmm.
was 8 years after the first one. Because I think they were about 4 years apart there at the beginning, and they famously, like Game of Thrones, like was not a successful launch, right? It took the better part of a decade to get there, and so that's a good company to be in. But
Definitely.
it's most overnight successes are not actually overnight, right? So
Totally. Totally.
I've been at this since I was 8 years old, so it's about time, right?
Yes.
Finally, but you really uh, you just have to, I've just kept pushing, right? And I think that's really the only, I think it's the only secret is just not giving up.
I love
Sometimes
that.
you might have to actually push for 300 years and you'll be dead before you get there, but you won't know how hard you have to keep pushing until you do it. So,
Yes.
um,
Yeah.
something about Sisyphus being happy goes here.
So book 6 is coming out in April.
Yeah.
What's on the horizon? Book 7 obviously is coming. Do you have a publication date for that set yet?
It'll be probably summer, early fall 25. I
Okay.
think Bane was saying maybe between July and September. September would be nice. Historically, I've gone to Dragon Con, and so
Hmm.
that's Labor Day weekend. So if it could be out
Okay.
for that, that'd be very cool. We will we'll see though, but it'll probably be by September. If it's October, that's okay, but it'll be something like that. I anticipate that I will be done with it around August, September of this year, maybe July. Like it could be earlier, but all these short stories are probably going to take longer than I want them to. Um, as far as after that goes, I don't really know. My instinct is that I will write a Sun Eater Universe standalone novel of some
Okay.
kind because I think my first priority should be to reassure Sun Eater fans that the universe is not done.
Hmm.
Um, but then maybe I'll do something else, right? Like maybe I'll do a Sun Eater standalone novel and I will do an unrelated standalone novel or
Okay.
something. But at that point, we're looking at like 2026, and that feels like 1,000 years from now.
Right.
I will have like a 3-year-old or something. So like it'll be a different world. But
Hmm.
I try not to think too far ahead, right? Like when I've been working on the series, like obviously I've always had my eye on book 7, but I wouldn't outline anything except the next book, right? I
Yeah.
wouldn't go too far ahead. I had book 2 finished before book 1 came out, and instead of write book 3, I started doing all these novellas instead because I didn't want to get too far ahead.
Okay. Okay.
So I don't know exactly what the next project will be until I get there, except that I'm pretty sure it'll be a Sun Eater Universe thing next, and then a new thing.
Right.
That's all I got.
Yeah. No,
No.
that's fair. It's
Yeah.
that is a long way to look ahead. So I think we'll be excited for what's coming in the next couple of years.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
there's a lot of other stuff besides. I've got 2 big surprises for everyone this
Okay.
year. So I won't say any more. But
We'll look forward to hearing what those are.
yeah, one of them you won't have to wait too long on.
Okay.
So,
Good to
you
know.
it'll be soon.
Awesome. So, Christopher, this is the greatest podcast in the multiverse. So that means it's time for my final question, which is, can you tell me how in a parallel universe a different choice might have shaped another version of your life?
That's a good question. And I thought about this since you sent me the email. This has nothing to do with the astronaut thing, but I think if I were to choose another career now, that I would go back to working in restaurants. And I know this
Oh,
sounds
really?
crazy,
Okay.
but I loved actually. Like, not that my parents would laugh at me because I would complain frequently about working in the restaurant, but like I deeply miss the like human element of it all.
Hmm.
Like, I was a waiter, but like I could see enjoying being a chef, right? Like,
Okay.
either just like in some sort of like, little small restaurant doing my little thing. Like, it's hard work, right? But like, I like working, and I like, I liked working with like the guys in the kitchen, right? Like that's sort of like an environment, right? It's pretty high stress, it's pretty high energy, but like it's
Yeah.
very rewarding. And it's like a very wholesome objective, right? Like, you're trying to feed people, you're trying to make them happy, and in a lot of ways, that's like what I'm doing now, right? Like, you're trying,
Right.
like if people are like angry about the books, I'm like, man, like that's a huge bummer. Like, that was
Hmm.
not the point, right? But like there's something that's deeply sort of rewarding about that, and like good food, like you have to sometimes explain why a book is good to people. Like, you don't really have to explain most food, right? Like, if
Right.
people eat it, it explains it by itself, right?
Fairly well. Yeah.
It needs no demonstrations, and there's something very like artistically attractive to me about that. So like I could see trying to like want to be very competitive, like in like in the culinary arts, like as a life that I probably will never live at this point.
Very
But
cool.
like
Yeah.
food is awesome. So
Yes,
like that's
it is.
probably where I would direct my artistic attention, if not to space romance. So
Cool. So instead of feeding minds, you'll be feeding bellies.
yes, yeah.
Yes.
Um, yeah, probably the Roman influence would not go away, I would
Right.
imagine. The blood runs true here,
The
so um,
right. Lots of
you know,
Italian
yeah,
food.
yeah.
Well, in a way, I'm sorry that I miss Chef Ruocchio, but in a very another way, I'm very glad we get to experience the Sun Eater series instead. So
Yeah, oh no, I really, having answered this question, right, I can't seriously think of doing anything else. This is, like I said, this has been the like single like monomaniacal objective of my life, and to be able to do it for everyone and for so many people is already a blessing. There was a um, fellow who told me a couple months ago that I will never be as big as I want to be, and like I already am. Like, I'm already further than I ever thought I would get. And it is a blessing and a privilege to get to tell stories to people that are abject nonsense that I've made up, and for those stories to be meaningful and to mean something to people, and to impact their lives in some small, but sometimes very very important ways. And that's the best thing about this, is getting those emails from people that say, hey, like, I had a pretty rough year, thank you for the book. I'm like, man, I have rough years too, I get it. It's the best job in the world, and to be able to do that, and to be able to be at home for my daughter, is a tremendous tremendous gift. So thank you to everybody who has read the books for that. So
wonderful. Thank you so much again, Christopher. Can you tell our audience where the best place is to find you and follow you if you're on social media at all?
yeah, so my website is sollanempire.com. Sun was taken, SOLLAN empire.com. that's got everything about my books and stuff on it. But I am on Facebook at facebook.com/the Ruocchio. My last name, unfortunately, not easy to spell. But I am
I know
also
about that.
yeah, man. Yeah, you would. But I'm also on YouTube at Sun Eater Books. I could get Sun Eater there.
Nice.
So I've got a YouTube channel and pretty much exclusively talk about my books and about writing. So
Cool.
that's probably the best place, honestly, if you do YouTube
Awesome.
at all. So
Very cool. Well, I will be sure to link all of those in the show notes. And thank you once again for coming on, Christopher. It has been a real treat to have you.
yeah, likewise. Thank you again for having me.
You're very welcome. Thank you for joining me. If you enjoyed the show, like and subscribe on your favorite podcast app or on YouTube. You can find me on Facebook and Instagram at Greatest Podcast in the Multiverse. As well, you can help support the show by supporting me on Patreon. For as little as $5 a month, you can get early access to the show, as well as submit your questions for my upcoming guests. I hope to see you next time. Bye now.